Yuma, welcome to the 2025 Aid Budget Breakfast. I'm Amita Monterola, and I'd like to acknowledge that we're coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here on the campus of the Australian National University. We pay our respects to the elders of all nations who might be joining us today, past, present and emerging. We acknowledge the major contribution that Indigenous knowledge has made to the work of the Development Policy Centre, the University, and to the aid and international development sector. I hope you have a coffee organised and that you're nice and comfortable. I'm very pleased to host my second Aid Budget Breakfast for the Centre. And the breakfasts that are now an institution on the Aid calendar were established by our Director, Stephen Howes, way back in 2013. And Stephen is online this morning. We will have about 20 minutes for question and answer at the end of our presentations today. But first, I'd like to introduce you to our Devpol presenters. So we have Senior Researcher, Dr. Cameron Hill, who will give us an overview of aid in the budget and recent trends in AIFFP funding. Then Research Officer Estelle Stambolie will present the preliminary findings of Devpol's 2025 Aid Transparency Audit. And Honorary Professor Robin Davies, who also produces the Dev Policy blog and the podcast with me, he will present the Global Aid Outlook. Now, before we start, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping and let you know where you can find all our research and the recordings of this session after it's finished. Already this morning, we've put out our analysis as a blog by Stephen Howes, so you can find that on devpolicy.org. You can find our charts on the Aid Tracker, which has been recently updated. Later today, you can find a recording of this presentation on our Dev Policy YouTube channel. And finally, we may be putting out a podcast in the next week. So please subscribe to our Dev Policy Talks channel, which has been relaunched and refreshed in the past year. And if you enjoy this event, I hope you'll join us for more Dev Policy events this year. We've got 3 major conferences, and the first being the Pacific Update on June the 3rd to the 5th. And submissions for this particular conference end next Monday, so please get in quick. Otherwise, you can join us at the PNG Update in August, and of course the Australasian Aid Conference here in Canberra in December. So please mark those in your diary. Now, I'd like to just remind you that we will be taking questions in the last 20 minutes, and today we have a question and answer panel. So please look in your Zoom screen and press on question and answer. Your questions will be submitted to the panel, and then when we answer them, they'll appear on the screen. So that's how it's going to work. Please put your name and your organisation in with your question, and hopefully we'll get through quite a lot of questions today, but otherwise we may reply to you by email if that's appropriate. Finally, without any further delay, I'll hand over to Cam to start the analysis of the aid budget.
Thanks, Amita, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this special March edition of the Aid Budget Breakfast. Yeah, my name is Cam, and I'm a researcher here at the Development Policy Centre. Before I start today, I would like to thank the team that's been involved in this work, particularly Sharon Liu and Estelle, who worked late into the night last night, making sure that all the figures and charts that you're going to see this morning were up to date, as well as the aid tracker that Amita mentioned. So yeah, we hope you find today's briefing useful. So let's get started with aid in the budget. So looking at the overall budget context, we can see that after a brief period of surplus, the budget is back in deficit for the foreseeable future. and the size of deficits increases this year and into the next. So the government is not pulling back on real expenditure, but continues to devote outlays to spending in areas like health, NDIS, defence, and other costs. So it's definitely not an austerity budget faced with these deficits, but one that reflects a return to the post-GFC, pre-COVID pattern of deficit spending. And of course, questions about how we pay for this growth in real spending continue to be debated and will be debated in the upcoming election campaign. But none of the real increases in government expenditure are going to aid. So while government spending is increasing, aid is being kept flat in real terms. And this means that aid is declining as a share of this expenditure. As many of you know, there has been a call from advocacy groups, NGOs, former defence leaders, parliamentarians and others for aid to be returned to 1% of overall government expenditure. And that's where it was from the early 2000s until the Abbott government's large aid cuts from about 2014. Full disclosure, we've worked with that campaign to help provide some research to help inform their materials. But as you can see from this chart, we're moving away from the 1% level, not toward it. Aid will comprise about 0.65% of government expenditure in 25-26, falling to 0.6% by the end of the forward estimates in 2028-29. So moving to last night's budget, I mean, I guess one of the big kind of themes, and some would say perhaps tensions in last night's budget, was that between kind of change and adaptation versus continuity. So in its budget materials last night, the government did recognise the big shifts and the uncertainties that are accompanying large cuts to global aid from the US and other OECD donors. But in responding to these cuts, the government has emphasised probably more continuity, reliability and stability over any big changes to the structure of the aid budget. And I think this is for two reasons. First, I think it reflects the fact that our region is not among the worst affected by these cuts. Bigger, poorer and more fragile countries in Africa, the Middle East and South Asia, will be those most affected by the US and other donor cuts. Second, the government's ability to cut programs outside our region is constrained by the fact that these programs have already been cut multiple times. Australia has already restructured its aid budget through both the coalition government's previous aid cuts and the bigger focus on the Pacific pursued by both parties before, during and since COVID. So as a result, only about 2.3% of spending in 25-26, or around 120 million, has been reprioritised. And most of this reprioritisation has happened in the area of multilateral and global programs. But there is one multilateral body that has received a boost, the World Bank's International Development Association, which provides concessional development finance to the world's poorest countries. And that fund received a 20% increase in Australian funding in its latest replenishment in December last year. Interestingly, even though IDA is a global mechanism, it is presented in the budget documents as a Pacific investment, not as a global program. So now we have, before the election, we have a picture of Labor's four budgets and four aid budgets. And this is what that picture looks like. I'll leave it to others to debate whether this constitutes rebuilding the aid program. But to me, it looks more like stabilisation, which some might consider an achievement given what other donors are doing. And it's this picture that provides the backdrop to the forthcoming federal election. As in 2022, foreign aid looks like it might make an appearance in the upcoming election debate. And of course, you'll remember in 2022, the issue was aid to the Pacific in the wake of the Solomon Islands signing a security agreement with China. This election, it looks like there could be a discussion around whether the aid program should be cut to help pay for further increases to Australia's defence spending. as the UK has recently announced. It's certainly an idea being kicked around in Australia's conservative media outlets. But looking at this comparative data, we can see that Australia already has a very high ratio of defence spending compared to aid. Over 10.1 in 2023, and I think this year, or in 25-26, it will be over 11-1. So the only other OECD donor countries with a higher ratio of defence to aid spending were the US, which is of course a global superpower, several Eastern European countries which share a border or are near Russia, and two countries, South Korea and Greece, which have active disputes with their neighbours and/or have very, very small aid programs. Now, looking at this graph, you'll probably know that these ratios are changing and will change. But even with these changes, I don't think any of these countries will overtake Australia on this ranking. So, for example, even after the UK cuts its aid by 40% to pay for increases to its defence budget, its ratio will move to 8-1, still less than that of Australia. And the unprecedented divergence between Australia's defence and development spending is still growing. On current estimates, the ratio will rise, we think, to about 13-1 by the end of the decade. If defence spending were increased to 2.5% of GDP by the end of the decade, this ratio would exceed 16-1. And at 3% of GDP defence spending, the ratio of defence to aid expenditure blows out to about 19-1. And you'll see there in this chart that during the first Cold War, Australia's defence development ratio averaged around 7-1 and never exceeded 8-1, even including at the height of the Vietnam War. And our colleagues at the Development Intelligence Lab have done some work on Australia's imbalanced statecraft budgets, which I encourage you to have a look at. I'm going to turn now to have a look at the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility, which we have some more information on as a result of recent reporting. So as you may know, the AIFFP was established in 2019 by the Morrison government as part of its Pacific Step Up, and it now constitutes a $4 billion financing mechanism, which comprises of $3 billion in largely non-concessional loans and $1 billion in ODA grant funding for the Pacific and Timor-Leste. And what the most recent reporting tells us is that while AIFFP was conceived largely as a non-concessional financing vehicle through which Pacific countries would have to borrow and repay infrastructure loans, it is looking more concessional in practice. This is because while only about 33% of the $3 billion in loan funding has been committed as of the middle of last year, grant financing is being committed at a much faster rate. 84% of AIFFP's $1 billion grant funding had been committed by 30 June 2024, according to DFAT's reporting. This comprises not only grant projects for grant capital for individual projects, but also grant funds that are being used to finance Labor's Pacific Climate Infrastructure Partnership and for various forms of technical assistance under the facility. So turning to the causes of this requires, I think, a look at the individual projects. And this was a little bit harder than expected. So I think while the reporting on AIFFP has definitely improved, you can go to the website now and look up individual projects, and there's much more reporting across the board. There are discrepancies between the projects reported in the AIFFP's own annual updates and the whole of program annual performance report. And I do want to thank the AIFFP team who helped me kind of decode these differences yesterday before this presentation. But for the purposes of looking at individual projects, I've used the annual aid performance report as it is the more recent report. It was only published a few weeks ago. And looking at this reporting, we can see that the number of grant-only financed projects exceeds the number of loan-financed and blended projects. So if you add up the grant-only projects through AIFFP and the grant-only projects through the Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership, both those bars in blue there, that's 17 projects. And the exclusively loan and grant projects add up to 11. So, as I said, many of these grant projects are financed through the climate infrastructure window. And even though these are mostly small renewable energy projects, they do add up. Another explanation for the bias towards grants is the fact that there's little demand and capacity to borrow among eligible countries, particularly in the wake of the fiscal pressures that were compounded by COVID-19. So only 2 countries, PNG and Fiji, have borrowed significantly using AIFFP loans, and PNG obviously dominates the picture. Even in the case of PNG, this borrowing is dominated by a single project, the PNG Ports project, for which it has borrowed $520 million. And this single project represents about half of AIFFP's total lending commitments to date. The bias towards grants in AIFFP is even stronger when we shift from looking at commitments to disbursements. So according to the latest AIFFP reporting, the facility spent 100 million in grants in 2023-24 and 34 million in loans. So a 3-to-1 ratio in favour of grants in disbursement. So what does all this mean? Basically, and we'll, I think, detail this more in a forthcoming blog, but I think the AIFFP will struggle to maintain its current 3-to-1 loan grant ratio. When we look at total grant commitments to date, the total loan and grant commitments to date, the realised ratio is more like 3 to 2.3, or almost 1-to-1. If this pattern persists, this means that in order to meet its $3 billion lending cap, the AIFFP would need an additional 1.3 billion in grant financing. Now, this may have well been provisioned for internally, this additional grant funding, but it will still be a decision that the next government will have to take. So thank you. I'm going now to turn to my colleague Estelle, who's going to talk you through a preview of our forthcoming 2025 aid transparency audit. Thank you, Estelle.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So aid effectiveness is a natural complement to analysing the aid budget. It asks the question, how well is the money that we budget actually used? And aid transparency is part of aid effectiveness. And the Development Policy Centre has been carrying out audits since 2013. And I will present some preliminary results from the 2025 aid transparency audit. First, the context of aid transparency in our last audit in 2022 is summed up by this quote from Terence Wood. Over the last decade, transparency has become worse in all areas and is now very low throughout all aspects of the aid cycle. From a transparency perspective, this is not in any way adequate. So this shows that things were quite dire for aid transparency, and there was a downward trend in all areas measured since 2013. That was in 2022. But then in December 2024, DFAT launched the Aid Transparency Portal, otherwise known as the AusDev portal. And there's some screenshots of the portal in the slide there. For the 2025 audit, we based most of our sample off IRT, that is International Aid Transparency Initiative data, and portal data. The AusDev portal uses IRT data for most of the information that's there. And we kept the same sample as previous years for comparability. As in previous years, we evaluated availability of basic information on 4 criteria. That was project description, planned dates, project budget, and previous financial year expenditure. And we evaluated availability of various kinds of documents from various sources, but I'm only presenting on 2 of those today. So in previous years, we also evaluated the percentage of projects that were covered on aid program web pages. But since this year we used the portal, 100% of projects were covered on the portal. So it's a pretty good before and after picture for the AusDev portal in terms of percentage of investments that are covered and available for the public to view. And similarly to this positive finding for availability of information, just in terms of knowing which projects are out there, the findings on basic information for these projects, from 2022, the negative trend was flipped, so that the score was brought up from below 65% to this year a score of 75% for average availability across all information types. And actually, if there were more years of data on the portal, Australian aid transparency would score 100% on our historic measure for basic information. So hopefully we can hit that milestone very soon. But not all is so rosy. Here on the next slide are availability results for two of the document categories that we analyze. And on the left, you can see plan and design documents continue the downward trend since 2013. And this search extended beyond the portal to DFAT country websites too. On the right-hand side, review and evaluation documents are improving and are in fact at the second highest level in the last 12 years. The DFAT evaluation page is a useful resource, and we included it in our document search for review and evaluation documents. A possible explanation for the difference in improvement across these two categories for this year is that plan and design documents would be from earlier on for current projects and would probably require retrospective uploading by DFAT, but evaluations are done on current and completed projects, and so the recent uptick shows current uploads. And this is hopeful that if current uploads continue in all categories, document availability will improve. You can imagine that if plan and design documents are uploaded from this point forward, that future projects would have more of these documents. But there is certainly still room for growth on document availability, and document availability translates to more detailed knowledge about aid spending, which is important. And we need that to increase aid effectiveness in Australia. The AusDev portal, the Australian Aid Transparency Portal, is a great tool for Australian aid transparency. And from carrying out the 2025 audit, our suggested improvements are, firstly, a continued commitment to adding more data to the portal. With such a good starting point, the portal should continue to be kept up to date and invested in as a resource for the public. Secondly, improved consistency of investment documentation would improve transparency and is necessary for accountability. And finally, more data downloads from the portal would improve accessibility of information and help those interested in researching questions related to aid. And so, in sum, the AusDev portal has brought improvements to Australian aid transparency, but there's still room for improvement. And I'll now pass on to Robin Davies, who will speak to trends in global aid volumes. Thank you.
Thanks, Estelle. I want to expand on some of those trends in global aid volume that Cameron referred to earlier in his presentation. There's been a lot of focus, obviously, on what's happening with US aid and, to a lesser extent, UK aid. So a couple of weeks ago, I went through an exercise to try to determine the possible impact of the cuts from those donors, but also a number of other donors if you look out several years to about 2027. We published a blog on this a couple of weeks ago, so some of the detail can be found in there. I'll keep this fairly high level, but just focusing on aid volume first, and then I'll come to the particular case of the US and some of the impacts of their cuts a little bit later. So, Amita, can you just put up your first slide? So the current situation is that around 10 of the OECD donor countries have announced significant cuts to their aid volume over the course of the last year or so. And those are the 10 donors you see here in this slide. Of those 10, 3 are most significant. They account for about half of the forecast cuts. In other words, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany. Those 3 countries are likely collectively to cut their aid by about 50%. Yep, that's the United States, then Germany, then the United Kingdom. And I'll come to a table showing the numbers just in a couple of minutes. Then if we move to the next slide, these are the countries that have not the countries that have announced an intention to maintain aid, but the countries that have not announced intentions to cut, and that's an important distinction. Some of these countries are definitely on the increase. Stephen's blog today focused particularly on the case of Korea. They have a very steep trajectory to increase their aid. Ireland has stepped up significantly. But some of the other countries in this category that I've called the non-cutters, we just don't really know. And the big one there is Italy. You would not particularly expect the current Italian government to be enthusiastic proponents of foreign assistance. But on the other hand, we have no information to suggest that they're contemplating steep cuts at this point. Likewise, Japan, no information to suggest that they're looking at cuts or increases, so all we can do is assume that they'll continue along roughly the current path, growing in line with inflation very roughly. So this is the most optimistic picture that you can paint of this group, and overall they increase their aid by around 12 or 13% between now and 2027 based on all of the information that one can put together. So if you put those 2 slides together, you get this picture. So this is a cut from 2023, which is the most recent year for which data are available from the OECD, to 2027, of around 1/4 on the assumptions that I've made for this exercise. And those assumptions are deliberately very conservative. Basically, if there's no information, I just assume a country keeps providing aid at roughly current levels, accounting for inflation. And if there is information, I've incorporated that as specifically as possible. And the huge unknown in this is what's happening with US aid. And the other 2 big unknowns are really Germany and Italy. Germany's in the category of aid cutters already, thanks to decisions of its previous government. And its new government seems likely to do even more aid reduction, but we have no information on what that might look like. And I've already covered the case of Italy. It's in the non-cutter category, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw reductions from them. So the best result I can come up with on all of the assumptions I've made is a global aid cut of around 25% between 2023 and 2027, and you can find the details in the blog that I referred to. Now let's go to the table, the next slide. Right, so this is just the same thing, but in numbers. And as you can see there, among the donors that are reducing aid, they're, on my assumptions, looking to go down by around 37% in total. But the big 3, the US, the UK, and Germany, will collectively go down by almost half. And then the smaller aid cutters are pretty much balanced by the smaller aid non-cutters. So they all cancel out. It's really what the big three do that matter. And then the situation could be aggravated if Germany cuts more and if Italy moves into the aid cutter category. So we'll just keep this slide here. So that's my very optimistic picture is a mere 25% cut in global aid. Of course, there's every reason to think that it's going to be a lot more than that. And I speculated in the blog that it, could be anywhere from a third to a half of existing official development assistance from OECD sources might disappear within only a few years. So let's come to the case of the US in particular, because they're the principal source of uncertainty in these numbers. There's been a lot of, I guess, chaos in the implementation of the abolition of USAID, the implementation of the so-called 90-day review of USA. There's been a lot of confusion in the media reporting around what's happening. And something new happens every day in terms of court challenges and court orders, and we have no idea to what extent that any of those court orders will be complied with. So what we do know is essentially based on a couple of leaks, and the Centre for Global Development has done some excellent analytical work and published their latest research just in the last few days. Which luckily is a bit in line with some of the conservative assumptions I'd made and not so much in line with the very pessimistic initial reports. So initially, there were lots of reports that, anywhere from 80 to 90% of awards were being cancelled. Some media outlets assumed that meant 80 or 90% of the dollars had disappeared, but of course not, because many of the awards are very small. The latest analysis from CGD gives a range of possible aid reductions in dollar terms. Approximately 25% to 50% is the range that they think has been cancelled at this point. And they lean to a preferred figure of around 34%. So, not as bad as some of the initial media reports. But on the other hand, even they are finding the numbers extremely hard to grapple with. So their worst case scenario at the moment is that about 50% of US aid dollars have been cancelled. And that actually corresponds roughly to my assumption in the blog from a couple of weeks ago. And I've further assumed that over the next couple of years, some more dollars disappear, and the end result is that US aid is only about one-third the size that it has been in the past. But these are stabs in the dark. And my own stab in the dark is based on the assumption that, no matter what your ideological stance is on overseas aid, there are certain things that any government is likely to continue to fund, including some forms of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and some forms of budget support to close allies and friends, and some forms of support to civil society organisations. And I would think that would account for up to one-third of any country's aid program. So that was my assumption about the bedrock level of US aid after all the dust settles. And so far, that seems consistent with the numbers we're seeing from CGD. Now, finally, just a few words on the impact of US aid cuts. A lot of the impact is really mediated through multilateral organizations. If you look at US aid to the Asia Pacific region, it's around a quarter of the total aid pie in this region, as it is globally. But a lot of that's further north. It's not in Southeast Asia so much. It's certainly not in the Pacific. And even in the Pacific, it's confined to the compact states for the most part. So if you look at the geographic region of greatest concern from an Australian perspective, a lot of the impacts will flow through reductions to multilateral organisations. And we know that There are questions over a couple of big pledges of the Biden administration to multilateral organizations, in particular, a $4 billion pledge to IDA, a $6 billion pledge to the Global Fund. And then we are already receiving in bits and pieces reports of significant cancellations of agreements with organizations like UNAIDS, UNFPA, UNHCR, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, IOM, and we're going to keep hearing these, obviously WHO. So I think the real impact in our region of the US cuts will be through the weakening of these multilateral organizations that we really want to remain in places like Suva or Port Moresby or Jakarta, who lose a critical piece of their funding pie, and continued support from Australia may or may not enable them to continue their operations. The sectoral impact, I'll just point you to that same piece of analysis that was done by CGD in the last few days. And again, it's sort of consistent with what I was saying a minute ago about that sort of bedrock type of aid. It appears that funding for most sectors has gone down by 90 to 100%, even infrastructure, certainly governance, education, family planning, all of those things have almost been zeroed. And the remaining funding looks likely to flow to humanitarian assistance, food aid, disaster relief, some aspects of health emergency preparedness and response, and maybe a little bit of macro policy support. So a much restricted sectoral focus. So I'll stop there and pass back to Amita.
Thanks, Robin, and we're very grateful for your analysis, drawing on years of experience working at both AusAid and also DFAT more recently. Thank you for that. And we're going to move on to our Q&A discussion. We've got around 150 people online, so it would really help if you find the question and answer panel and type your questions in there with also your name and your organisation. That would help a lot. Like I said, if you have a technical question, we may email you an answer. You can also engage with us online. We've got 4 social media channels, most notably probably Cameron Hill on LinkedIn is always ready to answer your questions. And we've also got still got a Twitter channel and Instagram and Facebook. So look us up there too. We're going to start off with a question from Geordie Fung. I'll hand back over to Cam to answer on the ODA budget in real terms. That's Geordie
Thanks,
Fung.
Amita, and thanks, Geordie, for the question. Yeah, you're right. There is a tiny small dip in real aid from this year to next. I think partly that's probably a result of the fact that the 2.5% annual increase doesn't kick in, I think, till 26, 27. And so basically what's washing through at the moment from year to year are the budget measures that government, the Labor government start, in 2022, after coming into office, its measures for the Pacific and Southeast Asia in particular are kind of still washing through, probably finishing up. So there is that small variation. But even when the 2.5% kicks in, I mean, there will still be some bumpiness. We've heard that, the AIFFP loans, the grant equivalent of those loans does kind of affect total ODA from year to year, kind of bounces around a bit. And of course, the 2.5% isn't an indexation commitment. It's a 2.5% annual increase. So if we see inflation, spike up again from year to year, then, we will see real aid go down. because it's not a commitment to index to inflation. It's a commitment from 26-27 to increase by 2.5% year on year.
Okay, and we might move on to the next question from Erin Ryan. Is there anything notable on climate finance in the wake of the climate negotiations at the end of last year? Cam, did you want to take that one as well?
Yeah, look, I think, the government has existing commitments on climate finance. It has a 2020 to 2025 target of $3 billion in climate finance. It also has this commitment in the aid policy to increase climate finance to 50% of all new regional and country programs over $3 million by the middle of the decade, and then to 80% by the end of the decade. Those commitments are washing through, and if you look at the government's budget documentation, you'll see various references to various climate packages, I guess, both in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But that's something we'll be tracking. So we do track on the aid tracker under the sectors page of the aid tracker. You can find our tracking of Australia's climate finance as reported to the OECD. And yeah, we will be, my colleague Terence Wood and my colleague Alyssa Lang will have a paper coming out, I think, in the coming months on Australia's climate aid, looking at the kind of trends, spending trends, as a result of going through that OECD data. So I think more to look at, more to find on climate finance.
Thanks, Cam. Well, we might turn to Robin now, if he can take the next two questions, both from Selena and Amanda Watson, looking at the second-tier donors and whether we can identify some future allies for humanitarian assistance and health, and what perhaps are the reasons that Korea and Ireland might want to increase their aid spend.
Thanks for those questions. On the second tier donors, when you look at the numbers, the second tier is a long way down from the first tier. Aid from all non-OECD sources, to the extent that it has been measured and reported, is around 7% of OECD aid. That's official sources, countries. And then if you look at private sources, philanthropic foundations and others, that accounts for, it's equivalent to about 5% of OECD aid. So it's hard to get excited about numbers of that magnitude. There's the case of China, of course, which is not in those figures I've just given you, because no one really knows what they spend. But there's been some academic work on estimating the size of China's spending if you just focus on the ODA-like spending. And again, they look pretty small, equivalent to a few percent of OECD aid, or, they're about the size of Norway if you look at it in those terms. But the measurement problems here are enormous. But when you put all that together, it remains the case that the traditional donor grouping, boring though they are, is massive relative to all other sources of assistance. In terms of allies, for the purpose of maintaining or increasing funding to, struggling agencies, including humanitarian agencies, I think it's probably best to start looking within the OECD grouping, and Amanda has asked about the case of Korea. They will keep increasing substantially for some years, but the way they operate at the moment is a little bit rigid, a little bit narrow in its sectoral focus, and I think there are opportunities for Australia and others to work with Korea in ways that broaden out the range of things that they do and enhance the effectiveness of it. So Korea is certainly a big one in our region. They've already overtaken us. Among the non-OECD donors, probably a couple of the Gulf states, particularly UAE, are important, but I wouldn't hold out too much hope of direct alliances between OECD donors and those countries. but they do operate with a lot of money, and they can have positive impacts in the countries they choose to work in. Now, on Amanda's question about Korea and Ireland, so Korea first, they've had a very long-term objective of becoming a mainstream and significant OECD donor. Right from the point when they joined the OECD, they stated that they wanted to become a member of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, but they deliberately held back until their ODA-GNI ratio was reasonably respectable before they even joined the committee. And then once they did, they've followed a very clear plan to accelerate their assistance. So it's really part of Korea's broader nation building project, and it's been a policy objective for them for a very long time. And I think in the current geopolitical circumstances, they would be even more likely to increase rather than reduce their aid. The case of Ireland, I can't tell you. I don't know what the policy basis is for their increases. They took a very big step up a couple of years ago, and I'm unsure whether that reflects a long-term trajectory to increase, or simply a moral stance of the Irish government at that point. So yeah, your guess is as good as mine on that one. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Robin. I'd just like to remind people we're getting a few questions through without identification. So if your Zoom handle is anonymous, please put your name and your organisation's name, if relevant, into the question as well. We might go to Rod Goodbun, who has identified himself. He was asking about the funding for Myanmar and Bangladesh, including the refugee camp in Cox's Bazar. Cam, did you want to talk about Australia's forward commitment?
Yeah, thanks. So I think in the budget last night, there's a commitment to a new $370 million, I think it's over 4-year package for both Rohingya populations in Cox's Bazar and vulnerable populations within Myanmar affected by the terrible conflict there. We don't know the split. I guess that'll be a subject, of a design of that multi-year package. But it's clear that obviously Australia will probably need to step up in Cox's Bazar as well as within Myanmar, given the news that the monthly ration for Rohingya in Cox's Bazar has been more than halved from US $12.50 a month to US $6 a month. I mean, that's kind of 20 cents a day per person, which is, I think the WFP's called it minimal survival level. So I do think, there'll hopefully be a look at that balance, but it's a hard balance because there are obviously also, populations undergoing severe suffering within Myanmar itself as well. But I think that package largely represents kind of a continuation of the levels of annual support we have provided since about 2017. But I guess the added dimension in the last few years has been the worsening crisis within Myanmar, which has meant the government has had to make these difficult, decisions in the context of an overall aid budget that's not increasing, about the balance between humanitarian spending in Cox's Bazar versus within Myanmar.
Thanks, Cam. And I just wanted to do a bit of a plug for the Dev Policy blog. We're doing a series with Médecins Sans Frontières, and we have featured various stories on both Bangladesh, Myanmar, and different refugee situations around the world. We were also working with ACFID to write some of these pieces, looking at some of the humanitarian assistance funding. So please have a look at the blog, and you can look at the tags on humanitarian aid for those stories. And another plug for the blog, also that we have been already publishing stories. As Robin said, he's got his the Global Aid Outlook. We've already had a blog published in the last 2 weeks, and Cam also has a number of different blogs on the multilateral aid situation, including the replenishments. And I know that there was some changes in the way that Australia is going to pay into some of those replenishments. Cam, would you like to just comment on what might be changing in that area based on some of the figures that we had last night, or some of the more details that were revealed?
Yeah, so the big one included in the budget on replenishments was, as I mentioned, the 660 million for the IDA replenishment, the World Bank's IDA replenishment, and that is a significant increase, a real increase of about 20% on our last pledge about 3 years ago. So that was the major one included in the budget. I mean, it looks like there might be some reprofiling of our existing commitments for global health replenishments, commitments we've already made. But, there are 2 replenishments kind of out there at the moment, both in the area of health. There's the Gavi replenishment, which is expected now to be finalised by the middle of this year. And then just recently, the Global Fund has put out its new replenishment calls as well. And, particularly for the Global Fund, the question of whether the US is going to continue to be that fund's biggest contributor is, I guess, a big question facing that fund. And for Gavi as well. Biden did make a significant pledge to this Gavi funding round, and it's not clear whether that would be honoured in any way by the Trump administration or by the new Congress. So, Robin, did you have anything to add on replenishments?
No, I think that's it. I mean, we've just to note that we've seen the initial Gavi replenishment discussion postponed already owing to uncertainty about the US position. So, we have no idea what's going to happen there.
Okay, we might move on to a question from Harry Pearl from Banar News. Thanks for joining us, Harry. He's asking, what proportion of Australia's aid budget has been allocated towards the Pacific in 2025-26? Is there any indication that Australia is stepping in to fill the gaps in the region, followed by the scaling back of commitments from USAID? Robin or Cam, did you want to take that?
Yeah, so I think so. According to our calculation, about 42% of Australia's total aid will go to the Pacific in 25-26, and that's kind of a bit of an increase from last year, which was probably just over 40%. So the Pacific is receiving the largest proportion of Australian aid, and that's that kind of growth in the proportion of aid going to the Pacific has been both a function of the fact that the aid program itself has gotten smaller, but also there has been a conscious effort over the last several years by governments of both persuasions to devote more aid to the Pacific. So about 42%. In terms of filling gaps, there is in the budget documents some discussion about the US kind of covering for potential gaps, particularly in health funding. So TB and HIV programs in PNG and Fiji that might be affected by the US cuts. So yeah, that is an area where I think the government is concentrating some effort, and also some civil society programs in the Pacific that might be affected by US cuts, which aren't big in dollar terms, but the US has played a big role traditionally in those civil society governance programs. I guess the big question is the compact states. As Robin said, the majority of US aid to the region, to the Pacific, goes to the 3 compact states. I think about 80% of American aid to the Pacific goes to those 3 countries. And, it is still unclear what shape that compact assistance will take in the future. The Biden administration had signed last year new 20-year compact agreements, but it's not clear whether the Trump administration will honour those or the new Congress will honour those.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Cam. And I might keep you on the line for this next question. We've got, an anonymous person asking about where to from here on aid advocacy approaches. Are percentage-based targets for lifting ODA now well and truly a thing of the past?
Well, percentage-based increases seem to be fine for defence. So it's interesting that, when we talk about aid as a percentage of GNI, we often get the response, well, those, they're not official budget parameters, or, those targets or those kinds of figures don't really mean anything. But if you look at the defence debate, for better or worse, it's all around percentage targets. Should we spend 2.5? Should we spend 3%? So, I mean, it is interesting, I guess, to note that, talking about aid percentages is now regarded as a bit old hat, but in defence, the percentage discussion is well and truly alive. So, look, I think, the crux of the matter is how do we ensure that the funding we provide for our aid program reflects our kind of wealth, and whether that's expressed as a percentage of GNI or as a percentage of government expenditure or whatever. We have signed up to the percentage of GNI target, so I don't think it's totally dead, but I do think the real discussion is about looking at what's happening in the world, looking at the way the government describes what's happening in the world, and I guess from my point of view, the disjuncture between those descriptions and what we're actually doing on aid, which is, as a share of national income, aid is falling and will continue to fall over the next 10 years.
Okay, we've just got a few more minutes left. We have 2 questions, but if anybody else has any other questions, this might be your last chance to type them in the chat. And as I said, if you've particularly got technical questions or perhaps questions for Estelle on the transparency audit, the team, also comprising of Cameron Hill and Terence Wood, can also answer those questions by email. So we're happy to take those as well. But I might just do a follow-up from Sebastian Sabagel from Apt Global. He is asking on the compact states that there was quite a large increase to FSM and separately to Tonga. Has anyone been able to look at why those figures might have been included?
I don't really know much about FSM, I'm sorry. On Tonga, that's linked to the, in 2025-26, I think about 25 million will flow in this new package of budget support, which I think is about $75 million that was included in last night's budget documentation. So yes, the Tonga additional is from new budget support for Tonga. We have ramped up budget support over the last few years, particularly during COVID, but as Stephen notes on the blog today, it's kind of bumped down again. So, and this package and others won't really see it increase again by that much. So, budget support is still happening, and Tonga is a beneficiary of it in this particular budget. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't help you on FSM.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. It's now 10 o'clock, so I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you to all the people tuning in at home. We've had a really wonderful turnout this morning, so I hope you all enjoy your coffee and your breakfast from here. In addition to our blogs and our charts already that have already been published on the Dev Policy blog and the new figures on the aid tracker, we're going to promote a link to all the slides presented here shortly on our social media channels, and the recording will be published on Dev Policy YouTube later today. Like I said, please keep in touch. Robin and I are always happy to take submissions for the Dev Policy blog. All the guidelines are on our website, and keep in touch on the social channels. Thanks a lot and good morning.